I'm John B. Rogers. I was born in Crete, Nebraska. I have a mother and father. They both grew up in Kansas. They both went to Kansas State University. In those days it was Kansas State Agricultural College, just like Colorado's A&M. So we moved around a good bit when I was in elementary school. And I give credit, that's why I can't spell, because I was never in the right school at the right time. And that's my excuse. My mother grew up in Kansas. Her grandfather came from France when he was a young man, so I'm told. So her name was Bajir. And in fact, my middle name was going to be Bajir, but they didn't like how that sounded, so I just have a B. And we finally ended up in Minnesota. And after 2 years there, my parents said, this is too cold, we're going back to Kansas. So we went back to Manhattan, Kansas. I should tell you also that, you know, all kids took shop in those days, and all girls took home ec. And so the shop teacher on his own decided he'd start up a new course called occupations, because kids ought to think about what they're going to do when they grow up. Somebody had put together 100 pamphlets, little thin pamphlets about everything from beekeeping, basket weaving, medicine, pharmacy, architecture, and so on. And there were 100 of those. And so in the class, we were required to read each of those, which probably was 10 pages or something like that. And architects seemed to have more fun than anybody, so I decided that sounded pretty good, so I started taking art classes. And that's been going on ever since. I didn't know anything about architects. There were no architects in Manhattan, but sounded good to me. And the book even said they made $100 a month, and that sounded like more money than I could imagine. We were all taking ROTC, and then they said if you enlist in the reserves, you could finish school. Well, that lasted 1 semester. And then they said, well, we changed our mind, now you're in the Army. So I went into Fort Leavenworth, and I was in the Army, and so then I went through the infantry school. And was assigned to a unit, 89th Infantry, and then we trained for a while and reorganized, and in Christmas of '43, I guess, we went to Boston, and then we were shipped over, and we joined Patton's 3rd Army. We stayed with Patton's Army. We were the 89th Infantry, and I ended up in the cannon company of the 89th Infantry because I'd been in anti-aircraft. And so I was a forward observer, so I went with the lead battalions and the lead companies. And we went across Germany and finally ended up on the border of Czechoslovakia, where we stopped to wait for the Russians. And that was the end, that was VE Day. In fact, I had to leave about 2 days before that, so I was back in Paris the 2nd day after VE Day, and that was really nice to be there. I came out here with a friend of mine who was in med school. I graduated in January. And so we went to a service station and asked, where do you ski? And he said, Winter Park. And so we said, how do you get there? So we went to Winter Park. And they had a barracks set up there that you could stay in with your own sleeping bag. And so we spent a week up there. We thought we were really doing great. And so Jim was in med school in Kansas City, so he had to go back. And I said, not me. I've already graduated. I'm just going to stay here. So that's how I got here. I went to other architects through the phone book. Everybody said, well, you don't have any experience. We can't use you. Somebody said, have you been to the Bureau of Reclamation? And I said, what's that? So they told me where the Federal Center was, so I went out there and I got a job as an engineer, level P1. And so I designed the reinforcing steel for the 7th level below grade of the Grand Coulee pumping plant. I presume it got built. And so I stayed out there for 3 months, and I said, now I got experience. So I went back around again. And Mark Musi, he and Smith, Hagner, and Moore were designing what started out to be the Denver University's downtown classroom building on Court Place. And the 4th floor was the architecture school with the big plaza out there. And John York was the designer who came out of the top of University of Texas. And so I worked with him, and we had a special office over in the Boston building. It was summertime and it was hot, and the bugs, we didn't have screens, and the bugs would come in and get under your T-square, and we had these greasy spots on our drawing, because we were drawing on 1000H, which is pretty bad. And if you race too much, it went right through. And of course, we were always behind. So we were working at night, and a streetcar would go by, and the dirt would come in the window, and they were also building a vault at the First National Bank next door. So that was really my first architectural job. You know, Grand Junction is always going to boom tomorrow. Well, this was one of those times, and it was uranium time. And so Grand Junction was going to boom, so Smith, Hagner, and Moore decided they would open an office at Grand Junction, and Tom Moore said he'd go over there and open this new office. And so he asked me to go with him. And I could do everything, take everything I had in my Foot Locker and my little car. I had a Raymond Loewy Studebaker. They advertised that both ends looked the same. You remember that? 1947 Studebaker. So I went to Grand Junction and found a place to stay with a family over there. And I worked over there with Tom for a year. All that year, Tom kept telling me I need to go back to school because I only had 2 years of design in architectural engineering. And so I said, just leave me alone. I just got out of the Army. I just got a car, you know. But by the time I was there a year, why, he was all right. And he had me sketch every week and make little sketches and drawings, and he'd criticize them. And he'd gone to Yale. And so he said, well, I should go to Yale. And so I wrote to the Yale and Harvard and some of those guys. Pennsylvania was hot at that time, and University of Texas. And everybody said, well, you can come next year or the year after that. University of Texas says you can come now. I said, that's for me, I'm now. Good profs and good experience, and I learned, and finally I used to try to go to the upperclassmen and ask them, what is good design? And they said, well, you'll know it when you see it. I came to Denver and got a job with Jim Sudler. I had 2 jobs. I worked for Jim and I worked for Al Grant, and because I had to get enough money to get married. And Al Grant had an office down here in it was called the Flatiron Building. It was down here, and I'd work there at night. And he had a sign in there that his people couldn't moonlight and work at night, but it's okay if I work for him. And so I did that. So we got married in July of '51. I worked for Jim for 3 years. We did what was the U.S. Bank, but Pay was doing the Mile High Center at the same time. So we met at the glass line. And so we got to meet Pay and Leonard Eason and all those guys. And I had a big thing about the windows on the second floor because we had the trust department up there. We wanted some windows, but he wanted those little slot windows, which are there today. And every time we had a meeting, it was not determined. It was put off till finally there was no time left, and so he got his way. Oh. And I suspect that was typical of
the way he worked.
The way he worked. Nice guy and good architect. I always wanted to do bigger work, and I couldn't get very excited about a house. I figured I could always do a house, but I needed to learn. And so whoever had the biggest job is where I want to go. And so Ray Irvin had just gotten the First National Bank. And so I went over there and went to work on that. And I had one banking experience. That was my second banking experience. And there was a guy named John McElwee out of Philadelphia. And so together we designed that building. And Ray Irvin came in one Monday morning, and he had met with the president, John Evans, who said he wasn't. We had the building set back, and we had a nice entrance plaza and all that stuff because we had plenty of land. And Evans said he wasn't going to give up 1 inch of his land to the city, and that building had to be on the property line on both sides. And so about 2 weeks later, I said, you know, I can do better than this by myself. And so I told Irvin, I'll give you 2 weeks' notice. He said, okay. He says, but you'll just fail and be back. And I said, well, we'll see. And so that was when I started my own practice. And I would have been happy to have been somebody's associate, but nobody would do that. As you might imagine, whatever you think your first job is doesn't turn out to be that, and so you don't have any work. And I did some back porches and garages and learned a lot of things. I learned I didn't know enough people, and I belonged to alumni organizations, both university and fraternity and so on. And I thought that those people who are in the business world would recommend me, but they won't recommend you because you don't have any credibility. Well, you have to get your first work from strangers, I learned. I figured out that I got to know more people, and you got to know people that know people. And so I went to the United Way and offered to, make calls for their funds. And you can get past all the secretaries to the decision maker, because that's the only one that can give money to United Way. And I found that's true with the Art Museum, and that's whenever you want to get to the chairman or the president, that's what you do. As an architect, you can't get past the first secretary. When schools were hot, you probably learned about Sputnik. Well, Sputnik went up about that time, and the whole country was embarrassed. And every school bondage passed. And whatever it was, it passed. People were really into schools. Denver was closed. You just couldn't get close to Denver. But Jefferson County was growing fast, and they had just consolidated. And so they had 5 men on the school board. One of them was an artist up in Golden, Hal Shelton. And so I went to see him and talked about design and talked about, and what they were building were whatever they had left over from before the war, which was pretty dumb stuff. And so I talked about programming, and I talked about design, and I talked about cross-circulation and the things that were current. And so I got a school. In those days, at least, you only got paid SD, DD, CD, and so forth. And you had to have enough capital to get through those stages. Well, I didn't have any money. Betty and I had saved up 10 grand between us, and we thought that was pretty good for starting a business, so that's what we had. And so I went to the bank, and I knew some of those bank guys, and I got a line of credit so I could pay my first guy that I hired. And then about, I don't know, a couple months later, Jefferson County called up and said that we just gave you another school. And the first one was Fairmont School, the next one was Wilchester. And so here I'm getting busy, so I hired another guy. So I waited till about the 29th of the month. I went to the bank and I said, now I got 2 schools, and I got 2 employees, and I need to double my line of credit. And the banker said, well, you can't do that. I have to do all these forms and go to the loan committee, and I can't do all that. And I said, well, last month you called me up to see if this guy was working for me, and yes, and did he make this much money? And I said, yes. And you gave him a loan for his car. And so how you think he's going to pay the loan? And the banker said, well, that's different. He's got a job. Ugh. Well, after a little conversation, we figured out that probably I better get the loan, so I did. I saw Jerry at a AIA thing, and we were both complaining to each other that we couldn't get any bigger work. We couldn't get a project bigger than $1 million. And every time the prospective client would say, well, what if you got hit by a truck? What would I do? And I'm sure everybody's had the experience. So we complained about that to each other for a while. And then in the school business, the State Department of Education had a lot to do with that in those days. And there was a guy over there, Dr. Cochran, who I got to know, and he called one day and wanted to get together. And so the schoolhouse in Primero, Colorado, burned down. And so they had some insurance money, and they needed to build a new school. He wanted to know if I'd do that. And I said, sure, I can do that. And so I thought, I'd talk to Jerry. I said, here's a good job. Let's do this together and see if we work together, okay? We'll have it for a test. And so we did. And then the Colorado National Bank, all the Colorado National Bank guys went to Yale. And Jerry went to Yale, and that was sort of the local Denver Country Club stuff. And I was a guy with bank experience, because I'd come through 2 banks. And so we told them that if we got the job, we'd be partners. And so we got the job, so next day we were partners. We had a competition for the convention center that Bill Muchow won. We were invited to that competition. And so we'd been talking with Vic, and we said, well, why don't you join us and we'll do this competition together. So we did, and we came out second. But we had the experience of working together, and that worked pretty good. We worked out of our office in the Sims building. So each 5 years, boy, one of those things happened. And each 5 years, we always moved our office because we ran out of space. And that's how we became RNL. You can't do everything by yourself anymore. And so you have to manage, and you have to market, and you have to design, and you have all the client stuff. And so we built these little teams, and we all ran these teams kind of almost like little fiefdoms for a while. And then when it got bigger work, then we started coming together. And we always had 2 principals on a job, because we always had a backup principal, and we always introduced the client to to the backup principal so that they know there's somebody behind you. And mostly along the way, people that joined us will like to do big, hard, complicated projects, which we find is the most fun. I did learn early on, you don't tell your clients you're having fun because they don't respond very well to that. We keep that in-house. You got to find the key to a project, or the heart of the project. What is, what's this project all about? And I'm not for designing for the fad. I think you design for the client, and it ought to be a long-term deal, and every client has some particular thing. For example, when we did Rocky Mountain News, I've spent some time with Bill Fletcher, the president, and I said, tell me about the Rocky Mountain News. Well, in the end, all of these stories came out to be local, solid, long-term, member of the community and all that stuff. And so we ended up doing a granite building. They didn't last 100 years, but it was supposed to. And so on. And same with when we did Rocky Mountain, or when we did the telephone company. The head guy, Lloyd Legier, said, no, I don't want it to look too good and don't want it to be too big. I just don't want to cause any, I don't want to be seen. Well, they had big needs, and so they're going to have a big building. And so I talked about character and quality and attitude, feeling, and all that stuff. And finally I said, how about a gray flannel suit? And Legier said, yeah, with a good lining. And that's what we did. And you need to find where that client is, and then you got a place to hang your hat. I just don't think you can just sit down and design something. Long ago I did a little church out on Arapahoe Road when Martin was coming to town and all this, and my client was 3 ministers. And I said, we got to write a program. You got to put out in English what it is we're going to do. Well, you draw something, we'll see if we like it. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And it took a year for them to finally write a program. And I said, where's the choir? 2 of them said, in the front. The other one said, in the back. I said, okay, that's not my decision. You guys have to figure that out. Well, that's hard to get you down to write a program. Otherwise, you never get finished. And I've found that you can't do everything. And so you can't be the designer, the marketer, the everything else. And so somebody has to run the place. And it's turned out that that's been my job, and it takes full time. And so I just came out to, that's what I do. And I critique some design, and I do this, and I deal with clients and all those things. I like to do that. I like to find clients. I like to deal with clients. I think that you need to find what you really like to do. Everybody says come out of school and they're going to be a great designer, and what, 2 or 3% become designers. If the earlier I think that you find out what you really like to do. I like to do bigger, harder projects, and you have to have a team to do that. And I like to lead the team, but I don't have to figure out the windows. It doesn't bother me at all. If somebody does a good job of that, that's just fine. I don't have to do that. I have to have a good plan, but if somebody else can make a good plan, that's okay with me. I just like to be the manager, and I like to make it happen. I think it's gotten really busy, and people try to build new buildings that look like they've been there for 100 years, little facades like this. I was just in Quebec City 2 weeks ago, and they have these little facades, but they also have been there 400 years, and the more they came different times, and they have a little different fenestration because that was the time. And I think it's a little bit silly on our part that we build a big long building and cut it up in these little boxes and pretend like it was built over 100 years. And the buildings that have more guts to them and more consistency really are the ones that stand out. But I think the long term is what architects really are responsible for. And I think it has to work for your client, it has to work for the future client when it changes, and be adaptable and so on down the road. I worry about the small offices because they can only do small things. And there's some of that, and some boutique is fine, but we are so scattered, and all these little bits of practice, if it could be consolidated, we could do much more, much better. I should probably tell you, why do we grow? People ask that. Why do you want to grow? You got to grow because we want to do bigger, better work, and we want to keep our people, and you got to have a place to grow to. And as soon as you put a lid on that, you're done. Architects are not going to stand still for the most part, and the ones that you want aren't going to stand still. The ones that you probably don't need are willing to stay right there. But if you don't have some way to allow that kind of professional growth, then you can't stay at the cutting edge. At least that's my opinion.
That's wonderful.
I don't even like to quit. So I still go by the office, and they still let me come there, and I'm still on the board. And so, but I don't talk a lot. They do all that. I'll give them suggestions sometimes. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't, just like your kids. And that's the way it is. And I've enjoyed my whole practice, and I like what's happened, and I would do it again. Except I tell people when I come around next time, I'm going to be a piano player on a cruise ship.